There are moments when Mickey Rourke appears before the camera like a body that has learned not to overreact. He sits still, his hands rest low, his shoulders drop just enough to avoid forming a stance of confrontation. His eyes do not seek the audience, nor do they evade it. They remain there, like a survival habit left over after countless collisions. That face no longer holds the shape cinema once favored. The familiar lines of the 1980s have been displaced by time and by choice. But what remains is not the residue of lost glory, but a harsher kind of lucidity. A gaze that does not ask to be understood, does not ask for forgiveness, and does not bow to soften what has already happened. Mickey Rourke rarely tells his story. He lets it fall out through silences that stretch beyond what feels safe, through breaths held too long in the chest, and through the way his body occupies the frame without seeking protection. What appears is not a confession, but evidence. In the face, in the posture, and in the ability to remain with the camera without trying to disarm its gaze. What makes it impossible to look away from him is not what has been lost. It lies in a quieter, more unsettling question. How much shame and vigilance must a person carry to spend a lifetime refusing to allow himself to be vulnerable before others, even when no one is hitting him anymore? Before Mickey Rourke became a screen presence marked by an almost instinctive vigilance, his life had already been shaped within spaces that were never truly calm. Born in 1952 in Schenectady, New York, an industrial city where family life was measured by work shifts, quitting times, and repetitive routines, Mickey grew up amid a rhythm defined less by emotion than by endurance. His father, Philip Andre Rourke Sr., an amateur bodybuilder who had served in the local police force, left when Mickey was around 6 years old. The departure did not arrive with a dramatic rupture. It was simply an absence that settled into the household, leaving behind a home that continued to function normally, yet lacked a support no one knew how to name. Mickey Rourke's mother, Annette Cameron, chose to move life into a different rhythm. After the divorce, she remarried a Miami Beach police officer and relocated the children from New York to Florida. The decision did not resemble an escape or a hopeful new beginning. It felt more like an attempt to rearrange what existed so the family could remain standing under available conditions. A new family structure, tighter, heavier, and with little room for deviation. He entered that structure through discipline and control, where the body was often used as a reminder of order. Confrontations did not require clear reasons. Sometimes it was a look judged too slow, a movement read as out of sync, or simply being present at the wrong moment. For Mickey, violence did not appear as an isolated eruption, but as a living condition, repeated often enough to become predictable. Within that space, Mickey began adjusting his own posture, sitting still when necessary, standing up slowly, avoiding prolonged eye contact, learning to anticipate footsteps in the house, reacting before words were even spoken. That violence did not create dramatic scenes worth retelling. It created a prolonged state in which tension became the background. When resistance was impossible within the family space, the body sought other ways to release. External scuffles, fast and forceful reactions gradually became extensions of the same survival logic. No one in that house spoke about what was happening. There were no conversations to recalibrate, no apologies to close things off. The family continued its routines. Meals were served. New days began. To survive, silence was sometimes required. And when silence was not enough, the body spoke instead. At school, Mickey did not merge easily into groups. He often stood at their edges, where observation outweighed speech. When conflict arose, The body reacted before thought, as if it were the only language permitted to exist. Small fights, disciplinary office visits, afternoons sent home early. A community gym in Miami introduced a different rhythm. There, Mickey found heavy bags, gloves, and an order that required no explanation. Boxing entered his life not as ambition, but as a structure that could hold him. Each session began with wrapping hands, tightening wrists. Each round ended with breath pulled back into place. Mickey trained consistently, fought amateur bouts, accepted impact as part of remaining upright. His teenage years passed in compressed intensity. Alcohol arrived early, not as rebellion, but as a way to blur sensations that were always on the verge of surfacing. The body learned endurance, the face learned concealment. What could not be spoken gradually accumulated into a quiet form of energy, ready to erupt when touched. In the early 1970s, Mickey left Florida for New York. There was no long-term plan, no carefully prepared farewell. He worked manual jobs, continued training, lived in temporary rooms, where stability was always provisional. The city made no promises. It simply allowed him to exist at a distance far enough that he did not have to turn back. Acting arrived late, almost by accident, as another space where the body was allowed to remain still and still be seen. At the actor's studio, Mickey did not arrive with a hunger for stardom. He carried with him habits of observation, deeply ingrained caution, and a body accustomed to reacting to the world. What formed during those years did not leave him when he entered cinema. It merely shifted locations, from the house into the frame. When Mickey stepped into film, he did not bring dreams of becoming a star. He brought the entire foundation with him, placed it before the camera, and allowed the world to decide whether it would see it or not. In the late 1970s, Mickey Rourke entered cinema not as someone being called forward, but as a body that had slipped into the frame. In 1979, he appeared in 1941, directed by Steven Spielberg, in a small, brief role that left almost no imprint on the audience's memory. There was no climax, no moment favored by the camera. Rourke passed through the film the way someone crosses a crowded lobby. Present, but never stopped, never asked his name. It was an indistinct beginning, but in terms of professional structure, the role placed him inside the Hollywood studio system, not at its center, but at its edges, where new faces learn how to stand still, listen, and wait to see whether they will be called back. Rourke did not emerge from 1941 with a sense of victory, nor did he carry the story of being chosen by Spielberg. The part was too small to retell, and that very smallness kept him in a state of observation, a newcomer without leverage, able only to appear at the right moment and then withdraw. In 1980, Fade to Black offered another opportunity, still a supporting role, but this time with enough space to reveal something Hollywood had not yet named. Rourke's character did not require much dialogue. What drew attention lay in the eyes and in the rhythm of presence. He did not push emotion forward, did not clarify motivation, did not invite the audience through accessibility. Instead, there was a contained instability, held tightly in the body, as if the character were always standing at a threshold not yet crossed. Some critics began to register this, not as a great performance, but as a sense of dislocation. Rourke's gaze did not seek direct connection with his counterpart. It often drifted sideways, settling into the empty spaces of the frame. His timing also resisted familiar Hollywood logic, where emotion is clearly guided and reactions arrive on cue. Rourke was slower. He allowed silences to last longer than necessary, leaving scenes feeling as though they had not quite been sealed. The difference became fully visible in the early 1980s when Mickey Rourke began to be placed alongside actors already secure within the system. In 1981, Body heat brought him into a cinematic world thick with heat, schemes, and sexuality. A space where every character competed for the frame. Rourke did not. He appeared as a deviation, not fighting for the center, not amplifying emotion, yet every time he entered a scene, the atmosphere tightened. The character Teddy Lewis did not require much screen time. Simply standing there with a cold, unfriendly lucidity was enough for the audience to sense a danger lingering at the margins. Attention did not come from what Mickey Rourke completed, but from what he deliberately left unfinished. The character was not opened up for easy access. Motivations were withheld, suspended in the space of the scene. Rourke did not offer safety. His presence triggered vigilance, making it impossible for viewers to fully relax while watching the film. 2 years later, Rumblefish placed that dissonance into the exact space where it could fully surface. The motorcycle boy was not a role designed to dominate the film. The character exists almost outside the orbit of conflict. Each time he enters the frame, the film is forced to slow down. The gaze does not soften, the rhythm remains unresolved, and silences stretched beyond what feels safe are left intact. The character functions more as an image than an explanation. Someone who has traveled too far beyond youth, observing the world from a distance the others have not yet reached. The film did not ignite the box office upon release, but the performance did not disappear. It lingered quietly as a mark difficult to name. By 1984, the Pope of Greenwich Village pushed that tension to the center. This time, Rourke carried the lead, a man pulled taut between loyalty, money, and irreversible bad choices. Yet even in a guiding position, he did not open his performance. Anger was contained. Fear was never spoken. Everything compressed within the body, producing the sense of a man trapped inside his own life. The role earned him a Golden Globe nomination in 1985, but what mattered more was the resistance Rourke brought with him. A presence that forced directors to adjust, co-stars to react, and audiences to remain unsettled. By the mid-1980s, Mickey Rourke entered the light not as a professional milestone, but as a wave of imagery. In 1986, 912 Weeks was not simply a film. It became a sequence of frames that detached themselves from narrative and circulated independently. Light, skin, breath, camera angles designed to hold the gaze just a moment longer. The box office return, close to $100 million, gave the effect a number to cling to, but what truly shifted was the way people began to name him. No longer as an actor on the rise, but as an object being looked at. Within that same film, Rourke did not open himself to be easily possessed. He kept the character cold and restrained, refusing emotional release, refusing to ask for understanding. Sexuality, if present, existed within control, slow, closed, and unfriendly. But once the film left theaters, those layers were quickly flattened. The publicity machinery and the popular imagination selected what was easier to consume. The body, a dark masculine appeal, a form of attraction safe enough to be seen, without needing to know what the person inside was carrying. A label appeared, convenient to the point of cruelty. Apply it, and the work is done. From then on, everything attached to him was filtered through the same lens. The atmosphere in a room shifted when he entered, not because he was loud, but because others had already decided how he was to be seen. What made this period frightening was not external pressure, but the sensation of reduction, a professional life that had been opening outward, pulled back into a single line. Rourke did not step forward to correct the story. There was no attempt to explain himself to the public. But in the choices that followed, a subtle deviation began to appear, not as rebellion, but as self-removal from a safe zone. In 1987, Angel Heart arrived as a precisely timed descent into darkness. The film did not protect the image the market had just assigned to him. It placed him in a space heavy with guilt, where the body was no longer something to be admired, but something that had to pay. Where sexuality was tied to decay and disorientation, not play. In Angel Heart, Rourke carried a kind of exhaustion that could not be named. Not fatigue caused by a specific event, but a lack of sleep prolonged long enough to become the body's climate. He moved through scenes as if trying to keep balance in a reality he no longer trusted. Eyes facing forward, yet the gaze unable to anchor itself to anything solid enough to lean on. The film's unease did not lie in what it revealed, but in the silent pull beneath it. The further one goes, the hollower the ground becomes, as if each clue only caused him to slip a little farther from the original point of support. This was not a place for him to be beautiful, nor a place where he needed to be attractive. The only requirement was precision. Of a man being stripped layer by layer, led by traces beyond his control, forced to keep moving even as certainty about the ground beneath him disappeared. Upon release, Angel Heart did not ignite the box office, but over time it remained as an unsoftened decision, and the performance remained in the same way, quiet, unresolved, resistant to comfort. From this point on, a silent tension formed in Rourke's professional life. One force held him in a familiar shape, while another pulled him toward choices that distorted the old trajectory beyond recognition. Mickey Rourke's career began to shift in a way that could not be reversed, not because he was no longer desired, but because the relationship between him and the filmmaking system had entered a different state. No longer silent tension, but conscious refusal. He was labeled difficult to work with, not because of lateness or technical indiscipline, but because he refused to be steered into standardized molds. During the filming of Angel Heart, Rourke repeatedly adjusted dialogue and scene rhythm, arguing directly with the director over moments he felt were being rounded off too smoothly. Not to assert personality, but to keep the character from drifting away from its original instability. In a system built on predictability, that kind of presence quickly became a liability. Major opportunities passed very close. Platoon, The Untouchables, Rain Man. There was no public dismissal, simply the continuation of plans that no longer required his name. Not because he lacked talent, and not because the roles exceeded his range. The issue lay elsewhere. Each time the name Mickey Rourke appeared, it carried a degree of uncertainty studios no longer wanted to absorb. Rourke's withdrawal did not require an official decision. Doors closed in the same rhythm as he stopped stepping forward. In rare moments of candor, he spoke plainly about his feeling. Acting had become fake from the inside, not in what audiences saw, but in how people were adjusted to fit the market. Standing before the camera under those conditions, for him, was no longer a profession. It was a quiet but continuous betrayal of the most serious part of himself. The fracture did not explode in a single moment. It accumulated slowly, through projects that went nowhere, conversations that failed to align, and the familiar sensation of being asked to repeat a flattened shape. By the end of the 1988-1991 period, the choice was no longer tactical. Either fully assimilate or leave the game. Rourke chose the latter. There was no farewell announcement to Hollywood, no staged moment to dramatize his exit. Simply the fact that he stopped appearing where he had once been centered, stopped negotiating for major roles, and allowed the absence to speak for itself. This was not the act of someone pushed out, but of someone who deliberately severed a familiar lifeline. accepting the loss of position, income, and security in order not to continue existing in a shape he no longer recognized as his own. When leaving the film system, Mickey Rourke did not seek a symbolic escape. He did not rebuild an image, pursue a comeback role, or use absence to generate myth. Instead, he returned to where the hardest part of himself had first been formed, the boxing gym, not as nostalgia, not as image-making, and absolutely not for the camera. There was no explanation attached to the choice. Rourke did not say he was finding himself, nor did he frame boxing as therapy. There was only steady presence in the gym, long sparring sessions, and a life rhythm organized around physical impact. If cinema had made him feel falsified, boxing did not allow that. Here, there was no performance, no distance, only reflex, endurance, and the real limits of the body. The consequences arrived quickly, without needing to be named. Injuries accumulated, repeated blows to the head and face, dizziness that lingered longer than usual, small delays in reflexes that only the person inside the body could detect. There were no public diagnoses, no medical records put on display, only the body beginning to carry the marks of decisions that could not be undone. Rourke's face changed in ways impossible to conceal, not all at once, but layer by layer. The nose, cheekbones, jaw structure, features familiar to 1980s audiences, gradually lost their original form. Surgeries followed, not to refresh, but to repair. But repair did not proceed in a straight line. Failed interventions stacked upon one another, leaving a face marked both by impact and by attempts to salvage it. There was no strategy to preserve the old appearance. The face was no longer adjusted to fit the frame. It stood as a surface that had paid for every choice. Meanwhile, cinema continued to drift out of reach. Major roles fell away from his orbit. In their place came low-budget films, scattered supporting parts, appearances insufficient to form a professional continuity. There was no official ban from Hollywood, nor were there public complaints from Rourke. The two sides simply no longer met at the same point. Boxing did not return him to the center. It did not function as redemption. It did only one thing. It recorded every decision in the body. Conflicts that had once existed within professional language left speech behind and moved into flesh, bone, and reflex. In 1997, he appeared in The Rainmaker. The role was not large nor positioned at the center of the story. Francis Ford Coppola gave Rourke a place that was just sufficient. It did not demand an image shift, nor did it require him to prove anything. He entered the film as a craftsman returning to work in the strictest sense, on time, in position, in rhythm. The performance passed cleanly without creating waves, but it was not swallowed either. Outside the set, life narrowed. Money became a practical concern. Past decisions produced concrete consequences. Living space contracted in the same rhythm, short-term rentals, possessions gradually sold off, movements calculated carefully around cost, as if life itself had to learn to lighten in order to continue. During this period, Rourke acknowledged dependence on substances, long stretches of isolation, and a prolonged sense of sinking. There was no narrative rearranged for neatness, no redemptive framing, just a sequence of days operating in a state of instability. What did not change was his commitment to work. Whether the role was large or small, whether the film drew attention or not, Rourke showed up, completed the scenes, and left when the job was done. He did not seek notice. He did not turn decline into a statement. The body already carried enough marks, the rest was kept silent. Around the mid-2000s, Mickey Rourke returned to the screen in a role not prepared as a reputation recovery. In 2005, Sin City placed him in a world where the body became the central language. Rough, scarred, always close to violence. Marv emerged as a man pushed far outside ordinary life, heavy, blunt, yet loyal in a way no longer accommodated by a neatly ordered world. Robert Rodriguez and Frank Miller made no effort to soften Rourke's altered face. They allowed it to exist as it was, a surface bearing the memory of repeated impact, and at the same time a place the character could anchor himself to remain in the frame. He did not need to push emotion forward. Standing in Marv's position was enough for the role to generate its own weight. Sin City did not immediately return Mickey Rourke to the center, but it reawakened a recognition long neglected. He could still carry the gravity of a major role, provided no one required him to become more palatable than himself. From there, cinema's way of seeing Rourke began to shift, not back toward the image of the 1980s, but toward acknowledging that he was still there, quietly and enduringly. 3 years later, the wrestler arrived with a completely different rhythm. Randy, the Ram Robinson, lives in small arenas, surviving on memories of a time already far behind. His body moves slowly, carrying old injuries, always hovering at the edge of an unspoken collapse. The resemblance between character and actor is evident, but the film does not turn it into a declaration. It simply allows things to overlap naturally, body, habit, and the long drain of time. Rourke does not explain Randy's pain. He lets it surface through small movements, through the way the character breathes, the way he rises more slowly after each fall, like someone merely trying to keep life going one more day. When Randy steps into the ring, it is no longer performance, but the last place he can still feel himself exist, each entry exacting a cost. Recognition arrived abruptly. In early 2009, Mickey Rourke won the Golden Globe for Best Actor, along with BAFTA and Oscar nominations. For the first time in decades, his name returned to the center of award season. But the moment did not open into a straight path. The Oscar did not come. And alongside the praise were familiar doubts about adaptability to the system, about discipline, about things he had never truly belonged to. The wrestler was a rare point of contact, where life and role stood close enough that nothing further needed to be said. It showed that Mickey Rourke could be seen again, while simultaneously exposing the limits of that trust, within a system that only opened its doors to him for very short intervals. Even so, within those brief moments, his talent still managed to leak through, quietly, without display, and refused to disappear. After that film, Rourke did not enter a stable cycle of revival. Doors resumed their familiar rhythm, opening, then closing. Following the wrestler, several large-scale projects appeared and then fell away, as creative disagreements quickly shut down the trajectory that had just reopened. There were larger productions, notable appearances, but nothing formed a continuous arc. Roles came sporadically. Working conditions shifted. Public attention faded at the same pace with which it had once surged. Rourke did not attempt to hold on to that moment. He did not construct a new image around a comeback, nor did he use the wrestler as long-term collateral. The years that followed unfolded more quietly, working when possible, withdrawing when necessary, and allowing private life to occupy more space than the profession itself. When the camera stops, Mickey Rourke does not enter a safer silence. He enters rooms without guiding rhythm, where time is no longer broken up by shooting schedules, and every collision drops directly into private life. There is no script to lean on, no cut to stop things at the right moment. Only the real person left to remain with himself, and with whoever happens to be standing across from him. In the early 1980s, as cinema began to consume the full rhythm of day and night, Rourke lived with Deborah Feuer in a space governed by the logic of work. Mornings began early and moved quickly into call times. Nights stretched on, often ending very late. Meal hours were irregular. Suitcases were rarely fully put away. Clothes hung ready for the next departure. The house grew accustomed to being empty during the day and lit at unpredictable hours. They were together during a period when everything still felt open, when the future seemed long enough that there was no need to stop and recalibrate. Family life existed within that constant motion, close enough to cinema to move alongside it, but rarely slow enough to become a private anchor. There were no major conflicts to name, just a shared life shaped around schedules, easily pulled off balance whenever the center shifted. The marriage ended in 1989, after nearly a full decade together, coinciding with the moment Rourke's professional trajectory began to drift off its familiar rails. They had no children. There was no publicly named incident, simply the gradual realization that they no longer shared the same rhythm, allowing the relationship to close in silence. When the door shut, there was no loud aftermath, only the sense that private life had never quite managed to stand on its own before being carried off by other movements. In the years that followed, as Rourke stepped away from Hollywood and no longer placed himself within the familiar operating rhythm of the film system, love entered his life in a different form. Without protective buffers, relationships moved straight into zones of impact. He entered his next marriage without having reorganized himself, carrying prolonged instability while the woman beside him stood at the center of a world constantly magnified and scrutinized. 2. Life rhythms placed side by side, unable to find a shared plane on which to stop. What unfolded within that marriage was not recounted as a staged tragedy, nor wrapped in conciliatory language. It exists instead as brief, cold legal documents, sufficient to confirm that safety boundaries had been crossed. There was no prolonged trial to explain right and wrong, only the necessary intervention to prevent further harm. Later statements were not meant to reconstruct each incident, but to clarify a prolonged condition, a shared life that had narrowed, personal space gradually erased, and fear becoming the baseline. Rourke did not choose to dispute details. He did not construct a symmetrical narrative to defend himself. In rare moments of speaking out, he acknowledged addiction, loss of emotional control, and having hurt those closest to him. No justification accompanied the admission, only the belated recognition of someone who had allowed anger and misalignment to lead for too long. After the marriage ended, the consequences did not leave with the paperwork. They remained embedded in daily rhythm. Day and night slipped clearly out of phase. Late nights stretched on, sleep fragmented. Mornings arrived without a specific reason to begin. Living space contracted, rooms falling so silent that the body tensed at every sound. Isolation formed not through a single decisive act, but through small choices, repeated over time. Unanswered calls, last-minute cancellations, avoidance of once familiar places. Rourke did not seek comfort, nor did he explain himself. He held distance as reflex, then gradually lived inside that distance. Conflicts did not disappear. They turned inward, becoming simmering anger and prolonged self-blame. Self-destruction did not appear dramatically, but through erosive habits, addiction, sleep deprivation, neglect of injuries. Boxing became a channel for tension that no longer had a place to settle. There, pain had a clear shape, cause and consequence aligning precisely. The body recorded every decision, no interpretation required. At the same time, he withdrew from intimacy. Conversations shortened, patience eroded, attachments requiring long-term presence became too demanding. As if he knew he no longer had the capacity to hold balance for another person without causing further harm. A simple but heavy truth runs through Mickey Rourke's private life. He has no children. not because of a carefully considered choice, but because the years passed in a state of misalignment. Unstable work, a worn-down body, and relationships that did not hold long enough to open onto a shared future. Later, he spoke plainly that this was his deepest regret, not as a loud tragedy, but as a door that closed without anyone noticing in time. Without children, Rourke's idea of family narrowed in a very concrete way. He formed deep attachments to his dogs, bringing them with him when he moved, caring for them as part of daily life. This was not a symbolic substitution. It was a form of attachment he could sustain, requiring no explanation, no long-term promises, and no obligation to repair the past. In private life, Mickey Rourke never found a structure durable enough to remain within for long. What remains are connections close enough not to vanish completely, and distant enough not to create further damage. Family for him does not exist as a complete entity, but as an extended absence, quiet, persistent, and impossible to fill with any role. In recent years, his rhythm of life has slowed in very concrete ways. Fewer appointments, less travel, and more hours spent at home. He has not disappeared, but he no longer presents himself as someone searching for a place. Interviews have become rare. Public appearances, when they occur, are usually tied to small occasions, a combat sports event, a fan gathering, or an independent film that finishes quietly and then passes on. The body now speaks more clearly than words. Rourke moves slowly, carefully, as if each step has been considered. His face no longer attempts to conform to the frame. It exists exactly as it is. There is no effort to smooth it out, no defensive gesture against the gaze. When he stands before the camera, he often sits still, allowing silences to stretch beyond what is customary, like someone accustomed to living outside the profession's urgency. Rourke still accepts roles, but under conditions very different from before. Small films, limited productions, short shooting schedules. He no longer carries the center, nor is he placed in a position where he must prove himself. These roles function as a form of minimal contact with cinema, enough for him to keep working, but not forcing him to re-enter a system that once exhausted him. Some projects are completed, others exist only within a narrow scope. No trajectory forms to be followed. Outside the set, life contracts around familiar habits. More time at home, light training, caring for his dogs, animals that often appear beside him in the rare images that surface. This attachment is not presented as symbol or therapy. It is simply a relationship that requires no explanation, no performance, and no pressure to become someone else. Mickey Rourke rarely speaks about his professional future, nor does he rearrange the past into a coherent narrative. When he talks about cinema, he stops at concrete matters: work rhythm, shooting conditions, the accumulated fatigue in the body. Everything ends there. In his 70s, Mickey Rourke lives at a slow, discreet pace. He wakes early, letting the morning pass in a small kitchen before the city opens its eyes. A cup of coffee cools on the table, needing no noise, no presence of screens. He does not try to return to former light, nor does he withdraw from the world. He simply chooses a distance that is just enough, where he can continue living without paying further for collisions already endured. For Mickey Rourke, what remains on screen is not tied to the number of awards or his position within Hollywood. What lasts longer is the sense of a person who was never flattened to operate smoothly within the frame. The traces of life, fatigue, misalignment, impact, are not concealed nor softened. They remain intact, accompanying the character, becoming inseparable from presence itself. Rourke's memorable roles do not align into a clear trajectory. They appear sporadically, like moments when cinema slows down just long enough for a body to be seen as it truly is. There is no preparation for easy reception, no protective layer to soften conflict. The character appears with both fragility and hardness at the same time, and makes no attempt to resolve that tension on the viewer's behalf. On set, Rourke often stays with a role for a long time, not through declarations or named methods, but through small details. The way he holds his breath, the way he moves a beat, slower than technical demands, the way he allows fatigue to remain in the scene rather than be removed. What might be considered excess in production is quietly retained as part of the lived condition the character carries. Rourke's influence does not crystallize into a model that can be copied. It appears instead in very specific choices made by later cinema. Characters that need not be pleasing, faces that do not require correction, roles that offer neither safety nor comfort. In those spaces, remaining with difficulty becomes an accepted possibility, unnamed and unendorsed. In recent years, Rourke has appeared infrequently, not because he has vanished entirely, but because he no longer operates within a rhythm that demands constant presence. Sometimes he works, sometimes he does not. There are periods when he nearly withdraws from public life. This rhythm does not carry the color of dramatic revival, nor does it slide fully into obscurity. It exists in between, where work is no longer the sole center and silence is no longer failure. At an age when many have already closed their story, Mickey Rourke remains present in his own way, without competing, without explaining, and without attempting to revise the past. What has happened to him, in his career, in his body, in his relationships, is not rearranged to become more acceptable. It is left as it is, allowed to coexist. Perhaps what remains in the end is not the question of how much Mickey Rourke has lost, but what he has managed to keep within a life constantly pulled in multiple directions. Amid collision, error, and erosion, one thing has refused to leave: the ability to remain present honestly, even when the cost has always been high. And when we look back on that journey, we may ask, not about success or failure, but something quieter. In a world that constantly demands fitting in, how much courage does it take to stay with oneself, even when doing so means no longer fully belonging anywhere?